Well, good morning, and my goodness, that was a hard act to follow, all that amazing, haunting music. It felt like my own heartbeat as I came to take the stage here. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, PopTech. Thank you to the audience for this opportunity to share my ideas on navigating risk, mapping resilience, and shaping the emerging growth landscape. And the company that I now run and founded after retiring as a business school professor maps risk, and so therefore I'm going to use those maps and those indices in illustrating my arguments. What we actually do is map risk right down to 100 meters squared if we're looking at conflict, province level if we're looking at human rights and health issues. We look at economic zones if we're looking at labour standard violations, 25 kilometres squared if we're looking at vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, natural hazards. Really to understand that rich picture of risk around value chains of businesses and organisations, supply chains, distribution networks. And I'm going to start with a story of perhaps one of my favourite maps. This is, well, we all know HIV AIDS is a really huge challenge in Africa, and I was a fellow of the World Economic Forum and asked by the CEOs of the logistics and transportation companies, UPS, FedEx, DHL, Agility, TNT, to really try and understand what it was that stakeholders felt were going to be the big risks out there that they needed to be thinking about for the next 5-10 years. And so I think they were all expecting what they did get in part, health, safety, congestion, pollution, emissions, to be up there. But what they weren't expecting were for civil society stakeholders to say, actually, it's HIV, AIDS in truck drivers and in the community through which they pass. So I went back, gave them those results, and they said, you must be joking. Incredulity. No, it's not our problem. It's out there in our supply chains. It's the challenge of governments. And I said, well, look, let's just look a bit deeper at this. And so I went off, did more research, and talked to the procurement managers. And sure enough, they said, absolute disaster. Can't find truck drivers anymore. They're always sick. They're either absent because they're going to the funerals of their families. Unreliability, and our business is booming. We're getting more and more business in. This is a challenge. So they started to take it seriously, but then looked at the whole map of Africa. Where do you start? So we started to map it. We had anonymized data sets from maternity clinics, worked out that women are only able to walk at most 25 kilometers if they're pregnant. And we're able to then make a movie over sort of 15, 20 years, and actually was able to see what was happening here. And HIV, sure enough, spreading from the Rift Valley right down those truck routes, and, for example, transforming already high prevalence rates, 1 in 3 in Botswana, 1 in 6 in South Africa amongst the working population, into 80, 90 and above % along the arterial roads, truck hubs, border crossings and ports. So becoming actually one of the biggest risks for any business, any organisation trying to get products into Africa and get commodities out. So, therefore, a focus as well, because we were able to actually work out where were the challenges. And so, from mapping risk to actually mapping resilience, the organisation started to work together. The logistics and transportation companies worked with the World Food Programme to set up mobile centres, health centres for truck drivers. The oil and gas companies that needed to get their product out developed these roadmaps up there. And those roadmaps, one side was the route the truck drivers needed to go on, and the other side were all the different health centres along those routes where they could get various types of medical advice and support, because continuity of treatment was the big challenge for truck drivers. And then finally we worked with Nike, for example, and Nike Foundation to work at ways for adolescent girls to be able to protect themselves with respect to HIV. And also we're working now and talking with a pharmaceutical company about trying to understand access to medicines there. So from mapping resilience, we were able to move towards shaping one's own growth environment, because it became obvious to actually flourish in Africa, this needed to be shaped. No one was out there doing it for them, despite the wonderful international initiatives that exist. And so, what is that growth environment? Well, here's where the growth isn't occurring. Europe, the USA, and unfortunately not a huge amount more in Iceland. But here's where it's occurring. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Iran, Mongolia, you name it, various economies are actually flourishing out there, as well as economies where that capital from China, for example, as we heard in the last presentation by the president, is most invested. Those economies are proving to be most resilient. For example, economies that are rich in natural resources, whether it's copper in Peru and Chile, whether it's iron ore in Australia, whether it's coal in Mongolia or Vietnam. These are the countries that are actually more resilient to economic crisis. And if that's where the supply chains of businesses, for example, need to be, here's where the markets are. Well, this is 2000, and you can see, as you'd expect, US, Europe, some of the biggest markets there, Japan. But 2012, the picture starts to change. It's the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, you'll hear me refer to them, and also Indonesia and Iran. And then 2025, look what's predicted. Europe's really quite delegated there, and it's these big economies, these big growth economies. They're not necessarily emerging economies anymore. They've emerged. The challenge is that those economies, top down, are beset by political risks, particularly macroeconomic stability, particularly regime stability, and particularly rule of law, and the lack of rule of law in part, and particularly the lack of an independent judiciary, which we've all come to appreciate, and the risk of conflict. You can see that actually the countries where most growth is occurring are the countries where you've got most instability with respect to rule of law, and where you also have pockets of conflict. And if that's the picture top down, the picture bottom up is very much one of endemic corruption, and here we've mapped corruption events, and also in the public sector, and also lack of corporate governance with respect to the private sector. And human rights remain and are particularly problematic. We've been mapping human rights for 5 years now. The picture only gets worse. Why in 2012 was it worse? Well, the Arab Springs and the repression of the Arab Springs, of course, and also, unfortunately, repression of cost of living protests with food price hikes on the ground. And then you also have the vulnerability of migrant workers, particularly those out in the Middle East, those out in countries where supply chains contract. Often they've had their documents taken from them. Often they're particularly vulnerable, no security of contract, and they suffer. And when prices are pressurized, their wages go down, as well as the cost of living going up. And thirdly, land grabs. Investment in biofuels, for example, investment in minerals. And so land grabs, and particularly in rural populations, real vulnerability amongst families, and child labour, 215 million children labouring or in child work around the world. Often 60% of those are in rural areas. So those are the three key reasons for a worsening of the situation. Of course, digital inclusion means we're also spotlighting the changes too, so we know more about human rights violations. Now, if that's the national picture, what's happening too with respect to globally? There are certain risks that exacerbate, they conflate. You can't look at risk in isolation. Andrew made that story very, very real this morning. And risk multiplies, for example, and is multiplied by vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, natural hazards, as Judith talked about this morning. Particularly, we see our growth economies, Pakistan, Thailand, Myanmar, very, very vulnerable, Peru, Chile on the Pacific coast. I mean, the CEO of Honda was on the BBC only a few weeks back saying one of the most challenging years was 2011 by virtue of the floods in Thailand, and completely destroyed the agility and the just-in-time procurement system that had been the making of that business. Increasing water stress, here we're looking at it subnationally, partly to make the point that you can't look at national averages. You really need to understand the detail in order to understand the pockets of resilience, but also to understand the risk that needs navigating. Food security too, major source of societal unrest. As global commodity speculation hit new highs last year, so did food security on the ground. So, is it all doom and gloom? Well, not really, because I love this map, because what this map shows is actually, it looks at political risk, but it's looking at which countries are actually improving fastest and which countries are getting worse fastest. And look at all of that, those growth economies, those emerging economies that I had said would be set with risk, actually their risk profiles are improving fastest. Now that's quite exciting. Unfortunately, Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, light's not at the end of the tunnel yet for them. And if I talk about why it is, they're bouncing back, and I love, Andrew's and Anne-Marie's definition from their forthcoming book at explaining resilience, the ability of people, communities, and systems to maintain their core purpose and integrity amid unforeseen shocks and surprises. That's exactly what I feel we need to map next, and that's what we're working on. The Chilean and Haiti earthquakes make that point really well. If you look at the red line here, which is Chile, and the blue, which is Haiti, Chile was actually one of the largest top sort of 10 earthquakes ever to happen, and 500 times more energy than the Haiti one. But the community, the country, was highly resilient. And you can see GDP hardly dented, even though $30 billion worth of damage was done, whilst Haiti significantly, it was 100% of its GDP impacted, so a significant dent on its performance. And indeed, poor resilience to natural hazards, one of the biggest challenges in these growth markets. But at the same time, their growth, their ability, and the growing middle classes and middle class of consumers with discretionary income are going to be increasingly buying insurance, so distributing and sharing the cost of those natural disasters, and one would hope locally building back better with more rigor in terms of buildings and building standards. But, why do I love these charts and figures? Well, they're not just describing today, but if we look at them over time, we have about 4 or 5 years data now, we can really start telling a story in terms of predicting risk in the future and being able to actually predict what is and being able to intervene, as it were. And I don't mean that in the sort of interventionist way, I mean it in the military way or in any in any way in terms of the political intervention, but we're actually able to engage in policy change to be able to shape that future growth environment and prevent disaster. And here's a chart which shows political freedoms, if you like, on the vertical axis, and social gain, societal resilience on the horizontal axis. In a Maplecroft map, 0 means extreme risk for a responsible business, and 10 means very low risk. And what we're looking at here is where most countries, it shows on a sort of track, where you've got poor political freedoms, poor social gains. Myanmar, Afghanistan, Somalia is down there in that corner. And you've got up there Iceland, actually, really exciting when I started to work out where is Iceland, right at the top in terms of great political freedoms, great societal gains. Most other countries sort of halfway up there. The darker the blue, the higher the income, the bigger the circle, the greater the growth. What you find is that something happens to some of those countries and they drop off. They're falling down. It's where the societal gains, such as digital inclusion, education, healthcare, jobs, and so on, tertiary education for youth, combines with oppressive governance to lead to a reduction in such gains and, for example, the risk of forced regime change. So no surprise to see Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya in that fallen oval, if you like. But it's also the other countries. This is my sort of fallen stars diagram. This is a coloured matchstick sort of collapsing. And basically what that's showing is risk, which can go in different directions. You can have forced regime change. You can have entrenched power like Syria, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, where the military have prevented or delayed change, or you can have reform like you see in China, which is literally reforming every day to prevent forced regime change and to continue in harmonious development, or Vietnam, which I would say is particularly at risk with respect to not engaging in reform fast enough. And we see some of our growth economies actually also, through being more resilient, bouncing back. Look at Myanmar starting to improve, Turkey, Uganda, and Sri Lanka. So what does that mean for the long term? What does it mean in terms of shaping the future growth environment? Well, I'm not saying don't go to DRC. Quite the contrary. DRC needs responsible business investment. In fact, the worst thing in terms of dealing with conflict minerals is to not mine in Africa and not to procure from Africa. 100 million artisanal miners depend on their livelihoods. Here in DRC, atrocious sexual violence against women in the Kivus, but down in South Katanga, actually businesses are resisting paying bribes, political parties starting to talk together more, and indeed Chinese investment, instead of using forced prison labour, are starting to use DRC suppliers, and you're seeing change. That's pockets of resilience need to be brought about. Here's an example, a project we worked on for a number of years with GE and the UN Global Compact. Why is GE interested in human rights? Well, they recognise they have to be in every one of those countries. They can't risk being seen as complicit in human rights violations, nor can they solve it. So what is very interesting, they're behind the funding of this major research program, which is actually putting all of these dilemmas out in the open, privacy of information, use of products, corruption, conflict minerals, you name it, water stress, child labour, forced labour, to really understand actually how can these be addressed, how can they be addressed responsibly, what are the dilemmas, and so on. And then finally, one of my favourites, a project we've worked on for 4 or 5 years with the UN Coalition for adolescent girls and the Nike Foundation, actually understanding what's happened. Where are those 600 million teenage girls out there that should be enjoying school, should be enjoying a childhood, should be training as young women to contribute to their local economies, should be having healthy children, rather than being in domestic servitude, rather than being in forced marriages at 13 and in very poor states of health. They should be enjoying that childhood. They should be in trainers. They should be enjoying football and other games. And for me, this is really exciting to see that change, because by actually making them visible, we can actually see what, we can visualize the difference that mapping and understanding resilience can make. And I'm going to end on a 3-minute video to make this point. your daughter, that sort of stumps me. But I basically said, look, we need to be in these new emerging economies. This is where the growth is occurring. This is where the markets are. Top down, they're beset by political risk. Bottom up, corruption, human rights. That risk is exacerbated, food and energy, water security, climate change, vulnerability to natural disasters. But there are solutions out there through collaborating, partnering jointly, and it's about actually understanding, building on resilience, mapping that future growth environment, and getting involved in action to shape that future growth environment in which to flourish. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Wonderful.